The Christians today aren't the crazy ones. If Christians today believe in things like truth, that truth is knowable, that there is a reality that's more than the physical, Plato taught those things. And he taught them in a culture where those were contested ideas, and he defended them philosophically.
Thank you for joining us for this interview. I have the privilege today of sitting with my friend and colleague, Dr. David Talcott. Dr. Talcott is a fellow of philosophy at New St. Andrews College, and he has recently written a book entitled Plato, Great Thinkers, published through P&R. The foreword is actually by Anthony Esselin, which is very cool. I can't remember what book it is of his that I read, but I remember he wrote a very spicy introduction to one of his books that I've thoroughly enjoyed. So I was glad to see that he wrote the foreword for this particular book. And David, you and I have talked a little bit about Plato in our exchanges, and very glad that you wrote this book. And thank you so much for sitting down with me to talk about it.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah. So I thought we might begin with simply, why did you write this particular book? This was released when?
Just this fall. Yeah, well, November of 2023.
Okay, so only been out for a few months, but something you've been working on for a good while. So
it has been in the works for a while, yes.
Yeah, so why this book?
Well, so I have been working on, I'm a professor, I teach philosophy, and I've been teaching Plato and researching and writing on Plato for quite a while. I taught for the past 12 years at the King's College in New York City. So year in, year out, I was teaching Plato and Greek philosophy to sophomores and trying to think about how to communicate these things and talk about the significance of Plato. And my dissertation in grad school was on Plato, so I've been thinking about him for a long time. And I think a lot of people write books too early when they don't really know enough. And I hope I avoided that. I waited a while before doing this, and I think I finally had a few things to say. But I think Plato is just, he's famously recognized as an important philosopher. Mm-hmm. Right, there's the famous quote from Alfred North Whitehead that the safest general characterization of the Western philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. So everyone knows Plato's important, but it is hard to explain why and how. And I really do think he's a great figure for contrasting with our current situation. I think he's very different from the way people think today, his ideas are. And so I think it's useful for Christians to read Plato and think about Plato for all kinds of reasons. One of them just being to help realize that the Christians today aren't the crazy ones. If Christians today believe in things like truth, justice in the old sense of justice, true justice, that truth is knowable, that there is a reality that's more than the physical, that life isn't just about the pursuit of pleasure or pursuit of your own self-interest. There are bigger things that ought to be pursued. Plato taught those things, and he taught them in a culture where those were contested ideas, and he defended them philosophically. And so I hope that the book is actually an encouragement to Christians as they read it, in realizing that they're not the crazy ones in the 21st century.
Okay. Yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it. You really, you just wrote, it's a great length, and you cover various facets of Plato's thought, which are very relevant to our own situation. Maybe first, just the man. Can you just tell us about Plato? Who was he?
Yeah, so we know only limited things about his life. There's actually a recent biography of Plato by Robin Waterfield that, if you want to really do a dive on it, that's the best place to look. He was born in Athens. He was an aristocrat. He famously was a student of Socrates, although Socrates didn't enroll any kids in any school, so that just means he was friends with Socrates and followed him around.
He just hung out with him.
Watched the action in the marketplace intently. But he obviously learned a lot from Socrates. So he was a young aristocrat. There were some young events when he was young that influenced his life and how he thought about things. So he was young in the low 400s, right as the Peloponnesian War was ending. So Athens and Sparta had been fighting for 30 years, that famous Peloponnesian War that Thucydides records all about. And at the end of the war, whenever you lose a war, there are difficulties in the nation, right? There's this exchange of power. The people who win put in their puppet leaders and so forth, and you have revolutions because it's never stable. And in one of those periods of instability, some of Plato's relatives got power. And so he was a young guy, we think maybe early 20s, late teens, something like that. And, his relatives say, hey, do you want a job in the new state government? Would you like to come to D.C.? We have a spot for you in the White House. And this is all recorded in his famous seventh letter that survives. And so he decides, to slow play it. He wants to see how things unfold before jumping into the new regime. And he says he watched what happened when his relatives got power. And there were other people, but his relatives were part of it. He was hopeful that it was gonna work, but what he saw horrified him. And he said, the new regime taught us how precious the old Constitution was, right? Because things changed for the worse, right? There was unrest. It wasn't full anarchy or anything, but it was a change for the worse. And it went from one injustice to another. It didn't go from injustice to justice. It went from one injustice to another. And that convinced him at that point, this is the story, this is sort of how the biography unfolds. It convinced him that he needed to turn away from politics to philosophy, to focus on changing hearts and minds and convincing people that they needed something different, instead of just driving straight at the political powers that be and getting himself blown up in the process. So he does talk about politics his whole life. His writing, he's concerned with politics and justice his whole life. But he never really, attempts to gain office or do anything like that in his life. So what do we know about him? Those are some of the big things we know about him. And if you want to see more detail, you can check out Waterfield's book.
Okay. I guess, you teach philosophy. You've studied philosophy for a long time. You've obviously studied Aristotle as well as Plato.
Yeah.
So I kind of have a simple question for you.
Okay.
Like, if both men were here, who would you want to hang out with?
Who would you want to hang out with?
Yeah.
I mean, based on what survives, you got to choose Plato for that. He's way more entertaining. I mean, Plato's dialogues are engaging. There's give and take. There's thrust and parry and turns of phrases and jokes. And so Plato seems, from the surviving evidence, you would definitely want Plato at the dinner party.
Okay.
He'd be way more enjoyable at the social event.
Okay.
Now, in fairness to Aristotle, there's a lot of his stuff that we know didn't survive. So maybe he was just as witty and engaging and so forth. But we don't know that.
Okay. All right. You have your chapters are laid out very helpfully, and I just kind of want to talk about them in turn. We'll see if we get through all of them.
Yeah.
Let's say we've already kind of had the introduction. Chapter 2, you have for the spiritual against materialism. What's that about?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that's really helpful for trying to understand Plato and Aristotle as well is that they have opponents that they're arguing against. And one of those main intellectual opponents is materialism. Materialism is a live intellectual option in the 4th and 5th century BC. It didn't just emerge on the scene in the 20th century, or Darwin didn't cause materialism or something like that. It's a really old idea that we can explain everything that is just in terms of the properties of the physical material world. If you want to understand everything, study the material stuff and how it operates in its own material nature, and that will explain it for you. And Plato and Aristotle both say, no, that doesn't work. That there is a rational spiritual world that is more real than the physical, which organizes and structures and orders the physical. And the physical comes from the spiritual, not the other way around. So it's very backwards from how people think about it today, where there's the physical stuff, and then maybe consciousness emerges out of the physical stuff. When you get the physical stuff arranged in the right way, consciousness emerges from it, and those other features emerge from it. And Plato and Aristotle argue vigorously against that. Plato even explicitly talks about that kind of view, that like the spiritual emerges out of the physical, and argues that the reasons that can't possibly be true either. So that's kind of the basic setup. And there's a number of ways that he argues against materialism. One, the main way that I describe is talking about his famous forms, right? Plato's forms. If people have read Plato, they might have run into that. The forms are the essences or natures of the things that exist. And what does that mean? Well, we're each human beings, but we are each two different human beings composed of different material stuff. Okay. So if you take you and dissolve you and pile up all your atoms, you take me and dissolve me and pile up all my atoms, right? We don't recommend doing this, but if you did do this, you would have two different piles, right? Your matter and my matter are different. At a material level, we share nothing in common, right? There's nothing in common in terms of the atoms that we're composed out of. So at a raw material level, it's hard to explain how we are the same thing, that is human beings. How are we the same? And so what Plato points out from thinking about things like this is that there are actually not just physical atoms floating around or something like that. There are forms or structures or organizations that things have. Yes, we have two different sets of atoms, but they're both organized in a similar fashion, right, as human beings. So there's an order and a structure that's present in the physical stuff, but it's not reducible to the physical stuff. And in fact, it organizes and directs the physical stuff. Our bodies grew into mature human beings from a little tiny organism. It grew into that, directed by what it is to be a human being, the human nature that we had. Right? Now, even today we talk about it like the DNA tells us how to grow or things like that. And we can argue about that. That's for the next book. But their point is like how did the little tiny organism like this in you and me grow into a human being, and someone else and the dog little organism grew into a dog, and the tree little organism grew into a tree. Right? They have a different nature, a different structure. Well, even if you don't buy that part of the argument, you have to buy the argument that there are different kinds of things. And his argument is that when you look and reflect on those kinds, you realize those aren't just physical. Those are spiritual or rational. Those have a different kind of reality than just the atoms do, out of which our bodies are composed.
So let's take this idea. I really do like this. I respect people that don't like this conversation. No offense. Yeah, but I do. If I'm honest, I really like it. I mean, I could sit around and I could talk to you till like midnight about this. But I do gather that, and I think it's usually practical people are like, if you say one more thing about this allegory in the cave, But we're here to say, you should be a practical person.
Yeah.
Who knows the nature of things and has thought about the nature of things? So I want to ask you a few questions about this.
Yeah.
Let's take my shoe.
Yeah.
Okay. So there is my particular shoe.
Yep.
And then there's shoeness.
Yep.
Now
you're doing great.
See, already people are upset. Somebody's mad. Great. Somebody's mad because I said shoeness. You just need to know.
Yeah.
We know you're mad. Just stick with us. Stick with us. Shoeness is a form.
Yes.
So shoeness is the form.
Yes.
And so let's take this idea and say my left shoe is there.
Yep.
Okay, but shoeness is a thing. It's a thing. It's real. Let's say it's real.
It's real. It's not a thing like you could run into it. You can't go find it in the next room or something like that.
Material.
So you're not going to bump into it in your garage at night. But it's real.
But of course, we are Christians and we believe that there's real spiritual things.
That should not surprise a Christian.
Should not surprise.
Wait, you're saying there's real things that aren't just material? Amazing.
Wow.
Right? Yeah. Yeah. That's not unlikely at all for a Christian. Yeah.
Okay. Now back to Plato.
Yep.
Okay, because you talk about his shortcomings, but we're back in the Plato's world.
Yep.
So there's my left shoe right there.
Yeah.
A particular thing, I guess we might say.
Yes.
And then there is shoeness.
Yes.
Now, punch into this. Where is, according to Plato, shoeness? It's spiritual or it's not material, but I'm like, where is it?
Yep.
Where's it located?
There are two answers to that. The first answer is it is located outside of time and space because it's not reducible to time and space. So it's located in a different rational realm.
A realm.
The realm of reason, the realm of spirit, of God, of things that are and don't change the way that your left shoe will change, right? Your left shoe didn't used to exist. And your left shoe will one day go out of existence.
Doctrinally, a realm of immutability.
Immutability, right. But what it is to be a shoe, and that's what the form tells us. It tells us what it is to be something. What it is to be a shoe is a truth, independent of whether there are any shoes. Right? Aliens come and destroy every shoe. There's still there's still shoeness, and we better hope so, because we're going to make some more shoes by thinking about shoeness. Right? We're going to think about shoeness in our minds. We're going to grasp that form with our minds and say, you know what? It'd be nice to go protect our feet again. Let's make these shoes. And so that's the start of Plato's argument is realizing the mind can grasp the structure of the thing, right? And what it is to be that kind of thing. And for artifacts, substances that we make, like shoes, then we can go on to make them. Natural substances like trees or human beings, obviously we can't make those, but we can still understand them. We can learn what an oak tree is, what it is to be an oak tree. We can learn what a human being is, what it is to be a human being. And again, if there's some kind of disaster and every oak tree is destroyed by a disease, there's still what it is to be an oak tree that used to exist and will exist again. And God knows it. And God could make that thing again if he wanted to.
Okay, so shoeness is in the realm of the spiritual or the rational.
That's where it exists unchangeably. Yes.
Immutability.
Rational realm.
So there's shoeness.
Yes.
But here's my left shoe. Right here. I mean, in time, in space.
Yes.
Very much mutable, as evidenced by all the scuff marks all over my shoe.
Yeah.
But now I've got shoeness in another place, in another location. I've got my left shoe right here in time and space. Indeed, and when I say another location for Plato, you're saying another location in the sense is outside of time?
Yes. Well, it's worse than that, because I said there were two answers, so that's the first one. The second one is shoeness is present in your shoe.
Shoeness is present in my shoe, even according to Plato.
Even according to Plato, yes. The shoe participates in the form, and the form is present in the shoe. What's weird about a form is it can be present in multiple places at once, which a material thing can't be, right? So if you have an atom here, it can't also be over there, right? This is one physical thing, this is another.
Even spiritual things, Christianly speaking, like an angel.
An angel or something, I mean, the metaphysics of angels we'll have to talk about. But with a shoe, right, you can have multiple things that are all equally shoes. And so what it is to be a shoe is present in all those things, different places, different times, and so on and so forth. But Plato argues it's not present perfectly, it's present deficiently or imperfectly. So that the shoe participates in the form, but not perfectly so. Your shoe is not perfect. It's not the perfect shoe. It doesn't define what it is to be a shoe. It's just a shoe, right? So that contrast you laid out is still there. But this is one of the puzzles, actually, that Plato grapples with throughout his writing, which is how to relate the two worlds. We have the rational world and the material world. They have different attributes. The rational world doesn't ever change. Being stays the same, right? The nature of human nature doesn't change, even though humans change. The particular things change all the time. They come in and out of being. The shoes come in and out of being. The humans come in and out of being. Everything in the sensory, visible, material world changes. Everything in the rational world of being, what really is, doesn't change. And yet we see that world of being exerting direction, order, influence, structure onto the physical world. How do those fit? And he works on that in a number of different dialogues. It's an interpretive puzzle with, where does he land by the end of it? We could do a whole course on that and look at the different evidence for it. But one of his famous dialogues, the Parmenides, he says this is the greatest problem for us to figure out, is how to really understand this relationship, right? And he says participation or sharing in an imperfect or deficient way. And that's his official answer, and he can't do better right now.
It reminds me of Augustine and his Confessions on time. He goes on and on. Time is this, and then he stops intermittently to pray. Lord, give me greater insight. And you're like, you're fighting with him. You're like, good, he prayed. Good, take another step. And eventually he's just like, I don't know.
So he struggles with it, and it becomes, this is what Plato does. He introduces all these great ideas and takes you the first couple steps in answering the problems, and then leaves the whole rest of it as, exercise for the reader for 2 millennia.
But we can. There's no way we're making it to all the chapters of your book because as I was manfully going to try, but this is the most interesting thing to me, and it's kind of you start there, and this is what Plato's known for.
The metaphysics is really the nitty gritty. Like, what is the world really like at the most basic, fundamental level? I mean, it's so important of an issue.
So you are saying my left shoe and your left shoe both participate in shoeness.
Yeah.
And that shoeness is one. And that shoeness is located in another realm. But you've said that you think Plato would go so far to say shoeness is actually located in my left shoe.
Yeah, the form is present in the particular.
Form is present. It's present in.
It's present in it, yeah.
Particular. Now, that, of course, brings forth the question, is how do we honestly contrast him with Aristotle then? Because isn't Aristotle the one who says the form is present in the thing itself?
Yeah.
So can we help me understand how Aristotle differs?
So the first thing to observe is there's a lot of similarity, which is under-recognized in some circles, that Aristotle is very Platonist about many things. So Aristotle's point was not to reject all of Plato. It was actually to do one of these versions of building on Plato. Now, there are some differences in the two. So Aristotle, for instance, tends to not talk about that deficient participation relationship, for example. And instead, Aristotle differs on what is more fundamental than what. Okay, so we're doing thorny metaphysics, which means we're looking at the different things that are and how they are related in their fundamental categories. And for Plato, your individual shoe is less real than shoeness. Right? Shoeness is the real unchanging thing, and your shoe, which is the material thing, is less real than shoeness, which is the spiritual thing, because the spiritual is more real. That is a point that Aristotle disagrees with. Okay, so in terms of what is fundamental, Aristotle takes a different view and says your particular shoe is more fundamental than shoeness, and shoeness depends upon your shoe rather than your shoe depending upon shoeness. So what depends on what? Does the form depend on the particular, or the particular depend on the form? And so that's a disagreement between the two of them, because Aristotle is concerned about this idea that you have this whole separate realm, right? That is difficult to accept. It's problematic. He thinks it's better to keep, like you said, keep the form fully present in the thing. So for Aristotle, the form only exists in the particulars. It doesn't exist separate from the particulars. And so when the particulars disappear, right, if you have this other disaster again and the shoes all disappear, Aristotle says shoeness no longer exists.
Shoeness is gone.
Because all the shoes are gone, and the shoes were the only things that had shoeness. So there's no more shoeness because there's no more shoes that have them. So there's an ordering relationship. What's fundamental that's different? Aristotle still thinks there are forms. He still thinks they're real beings in an important sense. He doesn't think they are fundamental in the way that Plato thought they were fundamental. So he downgrades their metaphysical status.
Plato, I would say, shoeness is one, radically one.
Yeah.
Would Aristotle say that shoeness is one?
He would. Yeah, he would. He would agree with that. He says it's one.
Plato would say that shoeness is eternal.
Yes.
Now, as Christians here, we're like, watch out now.
Yep.
He's immutable.
Yeah.
He has these. This shoeness now has divine attributes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But would Aristotle say shoeness is eternal?
It seems difficult for him to say that, like, for reasons I described, that once all the things that have that particular form go out of existence, the form is also gone as well. So it's hard to see how they could be eternal for Aristotle. Now, Aristotle thinks the universe as a whole is eternal, it seems like. He doesn't think there's a beginning in time. But all the cosmology there is a little murky. If you have like eternal cycles or something like that, where things come in and out of existence. But if the particulars go out of existence, the form goes out of existence as well. Okay. Yeah.
Maybe pop up here for a minute.
Yep.
Take a deep breath. We've been in thorny metaphysics, but some people are going to say, like, why this? Well, we branches of philosophy that you teach: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, those kind of things. Metaphysics deals with the nature of what is, the nature of reality itself. And I would commend to you, while there are questions we have, right? And some people might just want to say, Deuteronomy 29:29, man, the secret things belong to God, the things
Yeah.
revealed belong to us.
Yeah.
Do we not live in a time where people are denying the very nature of what it means to be male and female? Like, we are denying reality. And so
Yeah.
even spending time talking metaphysics is rare, like
Yeah.
what something is. And we need to know what it is in order to know what the world we're supposed to do with it. So thus, this is a very important conversation.
Yeah, there are some kind of micro level nitty gritty things that are just interesting to think about and argue about, and I do think we want to know them. The secret things are for God, but we don't know everything that's secret or not until we look at a lot of different things, right? Like, so we don't know how much we can figure out about the natural world until we give it a run, right? So at least I would hope people would give metaphysics a shot the way they would give physics or chemistry a shot, right? Like, maybe physics is going to foil our minds and we're never going to understand the fundamental physical structure, but we'll give it a shot. And I think you can do that with metaphysics as well. And again, some are kind of nitty gritty. Nothing huge turns on some details of metaphysics, but others are bigger, right? Like, is matter all that exists? And can you explain the basic features of the world just through the features of matter? Like, that's a big picture question that does have pretty big implications.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So those kinds of questions, I hope, those have kind of apparent, I think, interest for Christians.
Indeed. Let's do this. Let's have one more go at, and maybe talk a little bit about Augustine and how he is a Christian. I mean, he obviously was influenced by Platonic ideas, and of course he had his Manichaeism. So let's talk a little bit about Augustine, and then we'll just close out by, I do want to signal what the other chapters of the book, because you don't just deal with metaphysics, you deal with all sorts of dimensions of Plato. Mm-hmm. But since we're doing metaphysics, let's go ahead and finish the race here.
Sure.
Tell us what Augustine does. You have Plato, you have Aristotle, you have this idea of forms and participation in the forms. How does Augustine reconcile some things? What would you say about him?
Yeah. Well, I try to set up Augustine as the hero of the book in a number of ways. That he helps solve a number of problems that linger in ancient philosophy and answer some of the Greek and Roman questions. There's a history that I think that leads to Augustine. When it comes to these things, like you alluded to a minute ago, there's a concern about how this unchanging world of being and these forms and natures and essences, how those relate to God, and to understand what they are in a way that is compatible and consistent with and follows from the Christian understanding of God's nature. And when Plato gives his creation account, it seems like these forms are independent of God, that God doesn't have any kind of power over them. Their existence doesn't seem to depend on God. In fact, God seems to depend on the forms to use them to create, and he has to look outside of himself to this world of being in order to decide what to do with this material world. It also looks like for Plato, the material world is eternal, and it originally exists in a kind of chaotic and unformed state, and God comes and looks at the forms with his mind and decides to organize this physical matter in as good a way as possible, and then puts us here to help do that too. So there's that story, and there's parts of that are highly objectionable for Christians, like the eternality of matter, it's a problem, and the fact that not only matter, but the spiritual realm is independent of God, that's a problem. So one of the things that Augustine and other early Christians do to resolve this is they take the forms, and they keep them as these independent, unchanging things, but not independent of God anymore, right? Independent of the material stuff, not independent of God. And they make the forms, they put them into the divine mind, right? These eternal, unchanging forms are what God knows eternally. He knows himself, he knows everything he can do, and therefore he knows all these different possible things he could create and all their natures and essences, and so even if all the shoes disappear, and even if all the people were to disappear and nobody down here would know about shoes anymore, God would know about them and would have known about them for all time. So at that part of the story, that's how some of that gets resolved. There are other things as well. Again, there's this tension in Plato between, as we've seen, the forms and then the creator. And there's various points where Plato talks about the form of, when he's exploring these things, he explores what the highest forms are, and you're tracing this rational realm. What's at the top? And the form of the good is what he says is at the top. He does this in the Republic, a few other places. And so what Augustine and others do is move that into God as well. And so goodness isn't just some other thing outside of God. God himself is goodness itself. And so these eternal realities aren't separate from God, outside of God. No, they are the ultimate being of God's nature there. So a lot of that's a lot of Platonic ideas are compromised and made amenable to Christianity, right? It's not like Plato decided, or Augustine decided, let's just take Plato. He said, let's look at Plato and see what did he get right, what did he get wrong, what did he not understand. So you only bring in the stuff that actually flows from Christianity.
Right.
So
yeah.
Anyway, there's so much to say about Augustine. I mean, it's just so much to say about that, and how again, God is goodness itself, and how we participate in God's nature as we become good, and how there's no truly evil thing that exists. Evil is just a privation of what is good. Evil is just the corruption of these good things God has made. I mean, it just gets so rich. In that period.
And it's quite relevant. I just saw recently Jordan Peterson's wife has joined the Roman Catholic Church, and one of my there's this, you watch Peterson, you're just fascinated by it, but he has one clip out there somewhere on the internet about the what he calls the narrative world and the objective world.
Okay.
And I love it because his eyes are open about the objective world, and it's terrible. And he's always looking for this narrative world to inform us and to somehow help us. And he's not entirely sure if it's real. Like, he's like, it's real. Well, we treat it like it's real. Yeah. And he's read Lewis to talk about Christ as this one who binds, this narrative world and this objective world. And I was reading Augustine's Confessions, and he's talking about, the Platonic ideas. And he had this marvelous section in the Confessions where he said, he basically was talking about Jesus as a man, and he agreed that Jesus had a soul. So he's like, I wasn't guilty of the heresy that says he didn't have a soul, because how else did he, as a man, have, say, I think fellowship was the word he used, with the Word, with the eternal Word. And so it was like, but he still wasn't a Christian yet. Yeah. And he says in that moment, I knew nothing of the walking Word. That was his phrase. I knew nothing of the walking Word, or the Word made flesh. Yep. But he had Jesus as a human, and Jesus had to have a soul because he's somehow fellowshipping with the eternal Word. But he didn't have the concept that, the eternal Word is walking. In the flesh, the walking Word. And so it would be fascinating to just think how the Platonic ideas on the metaphysics is working with Augustine as he comes to see the deity and humanity of Christ. Yeah, and again, that problem for Plato of relating the two worlds, right? I would love to have watched Plato encounter the reality of the incarnation, where God comes down to us and just crosses the gap, like crosses that bridge. In the most powerful way possible, the divine nature fully dwelling in a human. That bridging is just an incredible truth of Christianity, right? That God didn't just leave us down here; He comes down to us. Amen. And that Platonism doesn't have the incarnation, and that above all, what is it? It needs that more than anything else to help fix it. Amen. And you talk about that in the book. So this has been heavy. This has been heavy metaphysics and been a lot of fun. See, we should have done ethics, like the practical stuff. People like that. No, I think people are yearning for that metaphysics now because of how crazy the world is, how it's gone. But just a few other, as we close out here, chapter 3 for truth against relativism and skepticism. Next chapter for virtue against hedonism. For justice against selfish power, for natural sex and marriage against indulgent passion, for the divine against atheism. And then you talk about the limits of Plato and God's glorious salvation at the end. You also have a helpful glossary in the book. I highly recommend you pick up a copy of Dr. Talcott's new book, Plato, Great Thinkers, published through P&R. And David, thanks so much for sitting down with me today. Thank you. Very happy to be here.